All right, we are live again, and thank you and welcome to episode number 2 of Condo Q's. My name is Ryan Stenquist. I'm the founder of Condo Services, and my co-host here is...
I'm Sandy Wagner, and I'm currently the president of the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association. Welcome.
Welcome. So today we're going to be talking about a very important topic. We could say it's a passionate topic, sometimes a controversial topic.
Yes.
And that, of course, is rental restrictions. So there's been some big news as of late, or some big possibilities coming up with rental restrictions in strata corporations.
That's for sure, yeah.
And this has to go back to the Rental Housing Task Force that was formed back in April of 2018. And what's happened is John Horgan, leader of the NDP, has formed this task force to look at options for increasing rental housing, making it more secure for both tenants and landlords, and they've come up with 23 recommendations to do so.
And 2 of those recommendations could directly impact strata owners. One of them is a good one, we think, to possibility of the strata to increase the ability to remove troublesome tenants. Because stratas right now have a difficult time with that. But the one that's controversial is the possibility that there may no longer be the ability for stratas to restrict rentals.
Yeah, so as it currently sits right now, strata corporations in BC do have the ability to implement a bylaw by a 3/4 vote resolution. Absolutely. Which restricts either the number of rentals in a building or gets rid of rentals completely. Of course, there's some exceptions to that.
Yeah, there are some exceptions for stratas that are 2010 and newer. They most likely have no rental restrictions, and that was something that was put in an effort to gain more rental housing stock. Newer stratas, 2010 and newer, don't have the ability to put in rental restriction bylaws unless they get the permission of the developer, which is not happening very often, we're finding out.
Yeah, so that goes back to the rental disclosure statement, which developers are required to file along with their strata plans.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
More often than not, and I agree with Sandy, more often than not, we're seeing that developers, in order to market their properties, are putting in these rental disclosure statements that last for 50 or 100 years, basically disallowing the strata corporation's ability to implement any kind of a rental restriction bylaw.
That's right, Ryan. But for those stratas who do currently have rental restriction bylaws, even if they say no rentals, there are always going to be a few exceptions. The Strata Property Act provides that you can rent your strata lot to a family member, and that doesn't mean your niece or your brother-in-law. That's very restricted by the Strata Property Act. Family is considered to be your spouse, your parent, your child, or your spouse's parent or child. Those people are not considered to be rentals if you're renting them out in your strata.
Absolutely. And the other exception that we commonly see is exceptions for hardship. Now, the test for hardship is fairly comprehensive, and you do have to prove that. The strata corporation, to the dismay of some owners that are trying to claim hardship, do have a great deal of power in requesting documents from the person that's trying to claim a hardship exemption. So things as far as financial statements, their personal bank accounts, personal financial information,
tax returns.
Yeah. That's all. That's the strata corporation is.
They're entitled to see all that information to make their decision.
Yeah, absolutely. In order to decide whether or not that exemption should be allowed. So, like Sandy says, you can never 100% get rid of rentals. There's always going to be some situations where, through the act, people are entitled to rent their unit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, with this new potential, with this recommendation from the task force, and depending on what the provincial government decides to do with it, they're talking about removing that section of the act. To remove the ability of a strata corporation to decide whether or not they want rentals. And one thing that I want to say before we go on, I'm sure Sandy does as well, is Condo Services, we don't take a formal stance on this. I have clients that I know of that are both for and against having rentals in their building. Me personally, I've lived in buildings with rental restrictions, without rental restrictions. I've owned in buildings, been a council member. I don't take a personal stance, neither does Condo Clear. How does VISOA feel about that?
VISOA also does not take a personal stance. Our members are quite passionate, and many of our members have written into the minister with their thoughts, both pro and con. Honestly, the majority of our members are against this proposed change, but that's not to say that that those who are fine with the change, maybe they just haven't written in. Yeah. So So we don't take an official position. Like you, Ryan, I've lived in stratas with rental restrictions, and where I live now currently, there are no rental restrictions, and I don't have strong feelings either way either.
Yeah. Stratas are very much individual. Every strata corporation is different. Obviously, the bylaws provide for some guidance and dictate what type of people and what type of atmosphere is in that strata corporation. But ultimately, in my experience, it comes down to the strength of the strata council themselves.
Well, that's just it, and that's what a lot of the stratas who've written to me have said. They're concerned that if there are fewer on-site owners, they'll have a smaller pool to pull council members from, a smaller pool of owners who are interested in helping out around the strata.
Yeah.
So I can certainly see their point.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is a very good point. And on that point, I've managed buildings that are 150 plus units, and you can only get maybe 15 or 20 people out to the AGM. There's not an active engagement.
Yeah, that's really
maybe that's to do with rentals, maybe that's not. But in those buildings in particular, just off the top of my head, you're probably looking about 60 or 70% tenanted units.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, and it is harder to get volunteers that way, for sure.
Yeah, it's harder to have that active engagement, absolutely. Yeah. So, any questions, any comments? This is something that's. Do you know when there's going to be a decision on this, or when the government, what kind of timeline the government is looking at?
I've heard a few various things. I've heard that they're not going to do anything about it until the end of next year, end of 2020. And I've been talking with a few people at the minister responsible for housing, and they wouldn't give me any timelines, but we're just hearing things through the grapevine.
Okay.
Because right now the property tax, the speculation tax, yes, that's only in effect for 2019 and 2020. So there's a timeline at that, the end of that, where they may or may not renew it, depending on what happens with these other recommendations.
And actually, just going back to what you were saying earlier, as far as people writing in and letting the minister know their views and the government know their views, or the various industry
reading
players.
Every one of those letters.
I believe that you guys have information on your website, or you circulated information on where people can send that to?
Yes, right on our homepage, visoa.bc.ca. We've got our blog post, and it has a link to send an email to the minister with your thoughts. It also has a link to the complete rental housing task force proposals, and the one that affects stratas, I believe, is recommendation number 13. Don't quote me on that, but it's highlighted. It's highlighted in our blog post.
Yeah. Great. So. The format of Condo Qs is, of course, we pick a subject, typically something that's going to be important in the strata world, and we discuss it for 10-15 minutes. We give you some background, and of course, we open it up for questions. Anybody have any questions or statements coming in? We've got my laptop right in front of me, so we can see you chatting. So I do have a question here. If they do change the SPA, Strata Property Act, do we remove our bylaws restricting rentals, or are those bylaws just null and void and can be left in? Well, I'd say from a housekeeping factor, it would be better to remove those bylaws just to clarify things, so there's no confusion over whether or not there's bylaws in place. Of course, that's something that I would imagine would require a 3/4 vote, even though the bylaw is technically invalid at that point.
Yeah, I tend to disagree, Ryan.
Okay.
I think I'm assuming that if this change was to come into effect, and any stratas with current rental restriction bylaws, if those bylaws are rendered void, there's probably going to be some sort of a grandfathering provision, so you'd want to still have your old bylaw on the books to show who's grandfathered.
If there is a grandfathering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting, and that's another important topic actually that you brought up, whether or not there could be any kind of a grandfather policy.
Yeah, because right now, when a strata creates a rental restriction bylaw, anybody who's currently renting their unit can continue to rent it.
Yes.
For 1 year after that bylaw takes effect, or until 1 year after the current tenant leaves. Yeah. So there's already a grandfathering provision, and I'd be surprised if that would be changed as well. But you never know. We can't predict what the lawmakers will do.
If it did go through and they were no longer allowing strata corporations to have rental restriction bylaws, then the only way there'd be a grandfathering clause is to allow strata corporations to keep some level of rental restriction.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
To keep the ones that are currently rented, and when they're no longer rented, the unit is back in the pool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So there'll be plenty of guidelines brought in if it does come to pass.
Yeah, and just going back to what we were saying about the rental disclosure statement, is this is mostly going to affect buildings that were built before 2010.
Mm-hmm.
I think the people that are going to be hit hardest by this are probably the older buildings, the 25, 30 unit or 25, 30-year-old buildings that have had rental restrictions for a long time, or completely disallowed rental restrictions. Whereas based on what I've seen in the industry, most of the newer buildings are allowing some level of rentals, especially on the 2010 and forward kind of timeline.
Exactly. The building that I moved from recently used to allow only 5 rentals. And then when the market was down and more people wanted to rent, they thought, well, let's go with the flow. We allowed 10 rentals. And that seemed to work well out of a 100-unit building. So about 10% seemed to be what was acceptable. So for stratas that have no rentals whatsoever, there's not that many compared to the ones that allow some rentals.
Some rentals, yes. Which of course, from an administrative, from a management standpoint, there's a whole host of other issues that go along with allowing some rentals versus allowing no rentals. From an administrative standpoint, it can be very challenging to track how many rentals there are, because of course you're always going to get people that don't submit your Form K, which is a requirement when there's a rental in the building under the Act. It doesn't have to be in the bylaws. Or people that are just knowingly renting without permission of the Strata Corporation or against the bylaws. So tracking those, keeping rental wait lists, often in buildings that have only 5 or 10 rentals allowed.
Can be a problem.
Wait lists can be very challenging to keep. It's a lot of administrative background. So a lot of, especially self-managed Strata corporations, should be aware that if they do have a limited rental pool, or they only allow, say, 10% of rentals or something like that, there is a lot of responsibility on them to make sure that their lists are up to date and accurate. Exactly,
and the bylaw itself needs to identify how you'll manage your rental list, and I've seen many strata bylaws that don't say that. And so what happens if 2 people put in a rental request on the same day and there's only 1 unit available? Or what happens if you pass the president in the hallway and say, hey, Joe, put me on the list to rent my unit, and Joe forgets. So it's very important to have a firm system in place and follow it for the rental waiting list.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like this is a good time to bring up that rental restrictions at any time are a very complicated section of the Strata Property Act. So of course, this is meant for general informational purposes only. If you do have this issue in your building, by all means, you can reach out to the SOA for support. You can reach out to Condo Q for support, but ultimately you might be in a situation where you have to get legal advice.
Yes, you never want to try and write or amend bylaws on your own. Always get legal advice for that. And even though this may or may not come to pass, it's probably a good time to check your current rental restriction bylaw to your lawyer and say, hey, is there anything in this that we need to change?
Absolutely.
Is it up to date?
Yeah. One other thing I do want to highlight, we chatted about this briefly, but one of the things that I think is important with these recommendations is the fact that this task force is also recommending that strata corporations be given more power and more ability to remove troublesome tenants. So as of right now, Section 138 of the Act exists, which gives the strata corporation the right to evict a tenant under, I think, Section 47 of the Residential Tenancy Act.
Yes.
The problem with that is there's a little bit of a hiccup, is that Section 47 of the Residential Tenancy Act doesn't actually allow a strata corporation to do that. So you've got a little bit of a disconnect in the legislation there. From my experience, again, as a property manager, is whenever I had a situation where there was a troublesome tenant and we were at the point where they violated the bylaws 3 or 4 times, and now we do have just cause to get rid of them, I typically pick up the phone, I talk to the owner of the unit, because ultimately they're the ones that are getting the fines. They're the ones being financially punished for the behavior of their tenants. You have a conversation with them. I never had a situation where they weren't amenable to solving our mutually
the mutual problem,
devolving problem.
Yes.
And usually 2 or 3 months, you can get that taken care of. Under the Residential Tenancy Act, it's 30 days for just cause to remove a tenant. Depending on that timing, it might take you a month or 2. But I found the best way to deal with that. Now, with this recommendation, if this goes through, regardless of whether or not they do agree to have strata corporations retain their right to restrict rentals, I think this would be a good provision to put in.
It absolutely would, yes, because the stratas have, as you said from your experience, stratas have a great deal of difficulty evicting a tenant. The best thing to do is just talk to the landlord, because you can issue the fine to the tenant, but if they don't pay it, ultimately it's the landlord who will be required to pay.
Yes, yeah, and that's it can get pricey. I mean, just under the standard schedule of bylaws, it's only $50 for maximum fine of a bylaw. But under the Strata Property Act, and most strata corporations do this, they can increase that fine to $200, and that fine can be levied every 7 days for as long as the bylaw continues to be contravened. Now, that can go even further if there's rental restriction issues.
If you have a specific rental restriction bylaw, you can fine up to $500.
Up to $500,
Yeah.
and what the government has also brought in recently is the $1,000 a day for violation of a short-term rental. Which, and there has been some cases of this. Specifically, I'm thinking of one in Vancouver where people are subletting their units essentially, so they have them under a long-term lease, but then they're using them on Airbnb or VRBO or those types of websites, and essentially they're exposing the owners of those units to potentially $1,000 a day
fines.
in fines.
Exactly. So a little off the topic, but still important, because those Airbnb fines, they're important for the stratas who already have a restriction against those type of licenses, and then they have to enable the bylaw to have the $1,000 a day fine. They can't just fine $1,000 a day without a bylaw to permit that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Where are we at now? So 6:46. So a couple other things we can chat about. Or highlight more so is under the current legislation, under the Strata Property Act as it stands now, there are certain things that the Strata Council, the Strata Corporation can restrict when it comes to tenants, but they're fairly limited. They can dictate the time period that the tenancy is allowed.
Oh, the length of time,
length of time.
Some stratas will put in a 1-year maximum or a 2-year.
And more commonly, it's a minimum. A lot of strata corporations will have a 30-day or 60-day or 90-day type of minimum, or actually, I was just looking at some documents for a strata corporation today, and I think this is the first time I've seen this bylaw, but it was a minimum of 2 months, but a maximum of 7 months in any 12-month.
Oh my goodness.
Period.
Okay, so I guess it's so the snowbirds can fill their empty units.
Guessing it is something to that effect. That was slightly unusual, but yes, the Strata Corporation, the council does have the ability to restrict rentals in that degree. What they can't do
is screen tenants. And that's the one thing stratas really wish they could do.
Yes. Yeah.
So the strata cannot screen the tenants, and they can't require the owner to put anything specific in the lease.
Yes. Yeah. There's no criteria that they can implement on the owner for their tenants. So the strata corporations are relatively restricted as to what they can require. Of course, I mentioned earlier, there's a Form K, Notice of Tenants' Responsibilities.
That's a real important document that
Yes.
quite often gets forgotten, not just by the renter, the landlord, but by the strata corporation, the strata council as well, if you're self-managed. It's a form that the tenant has to fill in and sign that says, I swear I'm going to follow the bylaws.
Yes.
And that has to be turned back into the strata corporation by the landlord of the unit.
Yes.
And it's crucial, because otherwise you can't find someone that's a tenant because they never agreed to the bylaws.
Absolutely. It's crucial for both the landlord and for the Strata Corporation, the Strata Corporation, so they can keep track of who's in the building. This is especially important when there's some kind of emergency situation like a water leak or fire or something of that nature. I don't know how many times that I've been in a situation where there's a big water leak, which does happen.
And you have no idea how to get a hold of the owner.
And you can't get a hold of the owner, you can't get a hold of the tenant, so next thing you know, you have the fire department breaking down the door, or you have a locksmith brought in to give you access. So it's important for the Strata Corporation to have that information, but it's also important for the landlord to have their tenants sign off on that, because if you end up in a situation where your tenant is getting fines against them and you're having to pursue them through the residential tenancy branch, that's a very important piece of information, because you as a landlord are responsible for providing a copy of the bylaws to your tenant and making sure that they understand what they can and can't do.
Yeah, exactly. My last strata had an occasion once where the landlord provided an out-of-date copy of the bylaws to the tenant, and the tenant was given a fine for breaching a bylaw that they didn't know they had breached because they had the wrong bylaws given to them. So it sort of puts everybody on notice to make sure it's done correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question.
Another question from Sharon again. Ruben, thank you. If they don't sign a Form K, can we evict them, or do we fine the owner?
It's the owner that's required to provide the Form K to the Strata Corporation, not the tenant.
Correct. Yes. So So Sharon, I'm assuming you're asking from a Strata Corporation standpoint, if the tenant doesn't sign a Form K or the landlord doesn't provide one to them. So in that situation, depending on your bylaws, like I said, the requirement for a Form K is in the Strata Property Act. Many Strata corporations do incorporate that as part of their bylaws. So I'd say that if that is a part of your bylaws, then you are able to find them, assuming you follow the proper procedures, which we're actually be talking about bylaw enforcement our next episode. So we can get more into depth there. But yeah, as long as it's in your bylaws, I would say that you do have the ability to find them. If it's not within the bylaws, you can still rely on the Strata Property Act.
You can't give somebody a fine for breaking the Strata Property Act.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. So ultimately, you'd have to rely on your bylaws in that situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So that's rental restrictions. We'll be keeping tabs on what's going on here.
For sure.
Again, this is a big topic.
It's a huge topic, and owners are so passionate about it.
Yes.
We've heard from several of our members who've said, well, I moved here from another province and I've never heard of this rental restriction stuff. What is this? Why can't I rent out my unit? And just as passionately are the other owners who say, I don't want my building full of renters. There's some misperception that renters won't care about the building. They'll cause damage. They'll be noisy, and that's not necessarily true. I've seen tenants who are fabulous, and I've seen owners who are less than fabulous. So it's personality, not how you pay your rent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do agree. I mean, in my professional career as a strata manager, I've definitely dealt with troubled owners, troubled tenants. It comes in every shape and size. Absolutely. It really does. But you hit on a good point that we haven't really discussed at this point, is that BC is the only province in Canada that currently allows stratas, or homeowners associations as they're known in the rest of the country and most of the world, to implement rental restriction bylaws. So this is something that we've enjoyed for whatever term you want to use.
Yeah, we've enjoyed this for many years.
That's right, that nobody else has had. So it is, I've had buyers come from Alberta or Ontario, and they're completely puzzled by why
they're quite surprised, yes. So I think that may be part of the reason why the task force made that suggestion.
We have another question. Are Form Ks required for short-term rentals? This is actually a very good question.
It's a good question.
So this is going to take a little bit of background. So Form Ks under the Strata Property Act and the bylaws, typically the wording that's used is leases, rentals, tenants, tenancies, wording like that, which imparts a higher level of ownership, let's say, by way of a lease. It implies long-term. It implies long-term. So Form Ks are required for anything long-term, like a lease, tenancy, etc. Where this comes up is short-term rentals, again, like Airbnb, VRBO.
They're not rentals.
They're not actually considered rentals under the Strata Property Act. Exactly. So you run into a situation where now technically Form Ks aren't necessarily required, again, depending on the bylaws of the Strata Corporation. So you can end up in situations where you don't know exactly who's going in and out of that unit. In the event of an emergency, you can run into issues. But I'd say generally Form Ks are not required for short-term rentals.
No, I mean, a smart strata would put something in their bylaws requiring the owner of a unit that's being rented out that way, requiring that owner to supply the strata council with updates every time that occupant changes.
Yeah. And actually, just since we're on this topic, and maybe I'll ask you, because you've got a really good finger on the pulse of the industry, is since especially Victoria and Vancouver have brought in really more strict bylaws surrounding short-term rentals, has that been less of a hot button topic than it was for the last couple of years, or would you still say it's still about the same? Yeah, it really is. It hasn't made a change yet. Okay.
The requirement on the websites when you're listing these units, there's a requirement to fill in your license number. Well, nobody checks it. Okay. So it's still very much complaint driven.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Well, there you have it.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, and just now that we're talking about this, short-term rentals will probably be a topic that we cover in one of our upcoming episodes, because of course this is something that's been important in the strata industry for the last 4 or 5 years.
4 or 5 years, yeah.
It really kind of hit its peak, I think, probably about a year or
Yeah.
so ago, but it'll remain a concern for strata owners, I'm sure.
Yeah, up till then, the only definition of short-term rentals that we had was snowbirds that want to rent their unit out for 4 months because they're down south.
Yeah.
And now we're hearing the opposite. The snowbirds want to stay here in the summer and go down south, or they want to stay here in the winter and go down south in the summer where it's to get out of the heat. Yeah, I'm saying it backwards.
Probably not this winter with all the snow that we got. Okay, so I think we've about covered. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention?
I can't think of anything else on this topic, but if I can do a little shameless self-promotion.
Of course.
Vizoa has some events coming up, and I hope if you're interested in attending, check out our website and all the details are there. We have 3 workshops for strata owners coming up in the month of March. Coming up this weekend on March the 2nd, we have one for brand new Strata Council members, and it's a really high energy workshop. It's a full day, so you'll get a chance to have all your questions answered. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday, the 16th, we have one workshop on strata maintenance plans. That's very important, how to take your depreciation report and dovetail that in with a long-term maintenance plan. And then 2 weeks after that, we have a workshop specifically for strata treasurers. Everybody likes to talk about money.
Yes, no, well, money's very important. Especially in a strata situation, especially if you get into a self-managed strata where the treasurer really has a great deal of responsibility when it comes to managing the strata corporation's funds.
Yeah, exactly. And the treasurer workshop is put on by Vizoa's treasurer, who's a number cruncher, and it should be a really good workshop.
Excellent.
It's always popular.
Well, good to hear. And we just had the Vizoa AGM on Sunday.
We did.
Which seemed to go rather well.
Yeah, the AGM went well. Now, how many of you in your stratas ever have a 30-minute AGM? It's a little different with an association, a nonprofit, because of course we don't follow the Strata Property Act, we follow the Society Act. But our AGM was over in about half an hour, and then we had a fabulous guest speaker afterwards telling us all about the Civil Resolution Tribunal.
Yes, that was a good talk. I was there talking to strata owners, of course. But would you believe that my fastest AGM was actually a sectioned AGM?
Oh, yeah.
I did both the residential and the strata sections, or strata corporation and the residential section in under half an hour.
Wow, that's awesome.
Kind of cheated a little bit, I admit. They had a quorum bylaw, they did not reach quorum.
Oh.
So we managed to get all the talking points, just the questions that people had about the resolutions out of the way before we actually started the meeting.
Okay.
So when we went through the meeting, it was motion second pass, motion section pass.
Well, that's kind of cheating, but whatever works, right?
Okay.
But you know, it's easy to get off topic when you're talking strata because it's such a huge topic. But that's a good reason to always have an information session before your AGM.
Yep.
Get all everybody's questions answered.
And actually, that's probably a good topic for an upcoming episode is meetings, how to put together meetings.
Yeah,
I agree. Is information sessions, especially when you get into complicated topics, can be invaluable.
For sure.
It can change the whole attitude of a meeting
from
something that's very contentious and very passion driven to something that's very orderly and straightforward.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. So,
all right.
So our next session is going to be the 12th. The 12th of March.
The
12th of March. The 2nd and 4th Tuesdays is when
I'm glad you remember because I was completely unprepared for that.
The 12th of March. And our topic is going to be how to handle bylaw infractions.
Yes.
A big topic.
Absolutely. So again, if anybody has any questions or comments or ideas for segments that you'd like to see, feel free to leave it on either the Vizoa Facebook page. Give that a like. Condo Clear Services Facebook page. You're welcome to comment there. And then also we have our event, which is Condo Qs, and I'll be putting up a new one for our next episode here, probably in the next couple of days. So by all means, if you're not going to be able to make it, forward us your questions,
send the question ahead of
your
time.
comments, and we'd be happy to address it live on air and give you some answers that you need.
Exactly. And if you're watching this not live, if you're watching us recorded later on and you think of a question, again, just send it to one of our Facebook pages and we'll definitely get an answer out to you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
we will see you next time.
Okay.